It's just so very good to be here tonight, and I want to thank the ACLU and the Institute for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to see Bruce Western, whose work and scholarship I appreciate and value so much, and have the opportunity now to meet some of the leading advocates here in Massachusetts. It's wonderful to be surrounded by people who are committed to having meaningful dialogue about this system of mass incarceration, a system that has devastated so many of our communities, decimated so many families, and turned back the clock on racial progress in the United States. The gathering really could not be more timely as our nation remains embroiled in the controversy over Trayvon Martin's death and the very delayed arrest of George Zimmerman. You know, of course, during the past few weeks, we've been treated to round-the-clock news coverage of the Trayvon Martin tragedy. Everyone from legal scholars to Jesse Jackson and Reverend Al Sharpton, as well as Fox News and CNN media pundits, have all weighed in on the meaning of what occurred that night between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. And I think one of the reasons that Trayvon Martin's death has resonated so powerfully for millions, but particularly for Black and brown men, is because it's one of those rare situations in this so-called era of colorblindness, a time when we have become so seduced by the appearance of great racial progress, a time when we are in awe of our nation's first Black president, and it has become a violation to even speak about race. Suddenly, the curtain is pulled back, and all you have is a young boy carrying nothing but Skittles and iced tea, and he is viewed as suspicious, as a problem, as someone who's likely on drugs, someone who must be confronted, interrogated, controlled, and put in his place. And it's this experience of being perceived as a problem, as a walking problem, as a perpetual threat, no matter who you are or what you're doing, even if you have nothing but Skittles in your hand. It's this experience of being someone who must be dealt with harshly, that unfortunately defines the experience of what it means to be young, Black, and male in America for far too many. Back in 1903, in his groundbreaking book, The Souls of Black Folk, W.B. Du Bois described the experience of being Black in America as the constant awareness that others viewed him as a problem. He wrote, quote, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem?" End quote. Of course, there's a profound difference between having problems, which white people are allowed, and being a problem, the embodiment of a problem. Du Bois characterized the defining element of African-American life back in 1903 as being viewed as a perpetual problem, one's very existence as a problem to be solved, to be dealt with, managed, controlled, but never solved. That was 1903. And today it's 2012, and the question seems as relevant as ever. To Trayvon Martin, one might ask, how does it feel to be a problem? It's easy to demonize Zimmerman, to view him personally, individually, as the problem, given the tragedy of what occurred. But by demonizing Zimmerman, we miss entirely the bigger picture. Our justice system has been infected with the Zimmerman mindset for decades, no, centuries. A mindset that views Black men in particular as a problem to be dealt with harshly, a problem to be controlled. And it is this mindset, the Zimmerman mindset, that has led to a brutal war on drugs, a get tough movement, and a prison building boom unprecedented in world history. It's a mindset that pervades our courtrooms, pervades the media, pervades even our schools, pervades the conscious and subconscious stereotypes that we all of us carry within us, no matter what color skin we may live in. And so what I fear has been lost in the public debate is that Zimmerman's mindset is not aberrational. It's normal. But today, in our supposedly colorblind society, we generally insist that only law enforcement act on this mindset. We've given law enforcement implicit permission, a license to act on this mindset, but there's a catch. Law enforcement, like the rest of us, must pretend and even try to believe that they're colorblind. They can act on this mindset, but not flaunt it. These are the rules of the new caste system. The uncomfortable reality is that if Zimmerman had had a badge with his gun, if he had been a police officer, we wouldn't even know Trayvon Martin's name today. After all, it's a crime for a private person carrying a gun to walk up to another private person, confront them, search all over their body, looking for whatever they can find, and use force, even deadly force, if the person resists. That's called aggravated battery, or aggravated assault, or assault with a deadly weapon if a private person does such a thing to another private person. But if a police officer with a badge and a gun does precisely the same thing, it's called stop and frisk. The experience of the person who is subjected to the encounter is largely the same. Fear, terror, uncertainty, sometimes injury, or even death. In fact, some people who have experienced being robbed at gunpoint and who have also been stopped and frisked by the police say their encounter with the police was more frightening. Millions of people have been stopped and frisked by the police in recent years, some as young as 9 or 10 years old, made to lie spread eagle on the sidewalk, arms wrenched behind their back as they're interrogated about who they are, where they're going, who they know in the neighborhood, do they have anything on them, what are they up to, what you doing, when all they may be doing is heading home with some Skittles in their pocket. It is precisely that kind of arbitrary, humiliating, and oppressive police conduct that helped to inspire the American Revolution and gave birth to the Fourth Amendment, which specifically prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. And yet here, today, 2012, we expect young black and brown men to accept these routine stops, interrogations, seizures of their person as the price they must pay for the security of others. It was reported recently that in New York City, more than 600,000 people were stopped and frisked in 1 year alone. 600,000. In 2010, the New York City Police Department stopped and frisked more than 600,000 people, more than 85% of whom were African American and Latino, and in only a tiny percentage of all these stops and frisks and encounters was any kind of citation ever given, any arrest ever made. In fact, in less than 15% of these stops and frisks, was there any kind of suspect description or investigation into a criminal case. Hundreds of thousands of primarily black men and boys stopped, confronted, just like Zimmerman did. Trayvon Martin, stopped, confronted. Who are you? Where are you going? What you doing? And yet, we say, this is the price you must pay for the security of others. I think it's fair to wonder, what would the New York City crime rate be if those 600 stops and frisks of innocent people were counted as crimes, as aggravated batteries and aggravated assaults? In fact, I think it's fair to ask this question in this era of mass incarceration, a time when a virtual police state has been imposed, not on everyone, but on certain racially defined populations. Who is safe from what? These stops and frisks send a message to kids at a very young age that no matter who you are, no matter what you do, no matter whether you stay in school or you drop out, no matter whether you get good grades or fail out, no matter whether you're carrying Skittles in your pocket or whether you've got some dope, one way or another, you are going to jail. And what is perhaps most disturbing is that, for the most part, many kids have grown used to this. I was listening the other day to a group of black kids being interviewed about their experiences with the police. One kid said he had been stopped more times than he could count, arrested twice, both times for supposedly resisting arrest when there were no underlying charges filed. But he had never gone to prison. But he said it like this: I haven't gone to prison yet, as though it was inevitable. Another kid who was only 15 said he had been stopped 4 or 5 times, but it didn't really bother him anymore. He said the first couple times were scary, really scary, but now he says it feels normal. His word, normal. It reminded me of how my father used to tell me that my parents his parents who were from Mississippi would have to pack lots of food before they went on a road trip because they knew they wouldn't be allowed to go into any restaurants, not even to use the restroom. And so he told me these stories of his parents growing up in the South and the kinds of indignities that they endured. And I remember saying to him, my God, that must have been awful, just the blatant discrimination, the dehumanization. And he said to me, yeah, it was awful. It was terrifying sometimes, but it was normal. It was just the way it was. He said, your grandma used to say, don't waste your time fretting over the rules of the game. Just play the cards you're dealt. And that's what they did. They had nothing else to do. So by demonizing Zimmerman, I think we miss an important opportunity to expose, discuss, and meaningfully address what has become normal in the United States. Utterly normal. Normal like separate water fountains. Normal like packing food because no restaurants will let you in. It's become normal for millions of young people to grow up believing that sooner or later they too will go to jail. Normal to be stopped and searched for no reason, confronted by someone who wants to know who you are, forced to justify your very existence, not once, not twice, but over and over again. It's bad, we're told. Yeah, it's bad, but it's just the way that it is. We're told it's the way it has to be. And I fear that quite unwittingly, many well-intentioned advocates and activists have done us a disservice in the Trayvon Martin controversy by treating his case as aberrational, as an outrageous, isolated incident. Many advocates have failed to convey that it is the Zimmerman mindset far more than the man himself who must be found guilty. It's this mindset that has become rationalized and normalized. And it's the rationalization of this mindset that has created an enormous amount of denial about what we as a nation have done again. We're living in confusing times. It's a time of great paradox. As a nation, we're still marveling over the election of our first black president, and yet a black child born today has about a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison. And if you go to many urban areas, many urban communities, the odds are far worse. Some ghettoized communities, nearly every black boy born today could expect to serve some time behind bars. How do we make sense of this apparent irony? Well, there's plenty of discussion and debate, particularly in the halls of academia. And outside those walls, there's plenty of shaming and blaming, but I believe there's a deep truth buried beneath all of the rhetoric, a deep truth buried between the lines of all the white papers and reports and analyses, a deep truth that we as a nation have been unwilling to face. In a speech just months before his death, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a blunt warning to America. He gave this warning after the Civil Rights Acts had already been passed, after the Voting Rights Acts had been passed and the legal regime of the old Jim Crow had been brought to its knees. He said bluntly, quote, "I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it, and a willing search for the truth, and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it." So in Dr. King's honor, I'll do my best to tell the truth about race and justice in America today, but this is a truth that most Americans will deny, just as they deny the truth about slavery and Jim Crow. But the truth is this: we as a nation, even in the age of Obama, we as a nation have taken a wrong turn, a tragic detour in the stride toward freedom. We've betrayed Dr. King's dream. A vast new system of racial and social control has emerged from the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow. It's a system of mass incarceration that would have Dr. King turning in his grave today. It's a system that shuttles young Black and brown boys and increasingly girls from their decrepit, underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons. It's a system that locks poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, into a permanent second-class status nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control. It is, in my view, the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, there was a time, as I admit in the introduction to my book, there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk out of hand. There was a time when I rejected comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, believing that people who made those kinds of comparisons and those types of claims were exaggerating, distorting things, engaging in hyperbole. In fact, I thought that people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But what a difference a decade makes. For after years of working as a civil rights lawyer, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality, and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who had been released from prison re-enter into a society that had never shown much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I now call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is just so obvious to me now, that what seems odd in retrospect is that I could have been blind to it for so long. As I describe in the introduction, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Like I said, I reached this conclusion reluctantly. I had a number of experiences that slowly began to open my eyes, but one in particular I won't ever forget. It involved a young African-American man who was about 19 years old who walked into my office one day and forever changed the way I viewed our criminal justice system, but also how I viewed myself as a civil rights lawyer and advocate. At the time, I was directing the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU in California, and we had launched a major campaign against racial profiling by the police. We called it the DWB campaign, or the Driving While Black or Brown campaign. And we had already sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling in their drug interdiction program, but we were looking to sue some other police departments in California as well, where we had received reports of discriminatory tactics by the police. And so we had created a hotline number for people to call if they believe they had been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And we put this hotline number up on billboards in Oakland and San Jose and other communities in California, urging people to call the hotline if they believed they had been subjected to discriminatory treatment by the police. And in fact, within the first few minutes that we announced the hotline number on the evening news, we received thousands of calls and our system crashed temporarily. We had to expand our capacity. And so I was spending my day interviewing one young black man after another who had stories of being stopped, searched, sometimes brutalized for no apparent reason other than their race. And it was getting late in the day, it was in the afternoon, I was getting a little tired. And this young man walks into my office carrying a stack of papers about this thick. He had taken detailed notes of his encounters with the police over a 9-month period of time. Descriptions of every encounter, every stop, every search, every time he was stopped on the sidewalk, every time he was pulled over in his vehicle. He had names of officers, names of witnesses, in some cases even badge numbers. Just an extraordinary amount of detail and documentation. And on top of that, he was a good-looking young man. He was good-looking, well-spoken, and I started to think, here's our dream plaintiff. Here's the one we've been looking for. And the stories he had been telling about his discriminatory encounters with the police in Oakland were corroborated by many of the other stories we had heard coming out of his neighborhood. And so I started getting excited, asking him more questions, trying to figure out maybe he's the one. He could be the lead plaintiff in the class suit we were planning to file, and going back and forth. And then he says something that makes me pause. And I said, did you just say you have a drug felony? And he gets quiet for a minute, and he stares down the table, and he looks up and looks me right in the eye, and he's like, yeah, I have a drug felony, but let me tell you what happened. Now, we had been screening people, prior criminal records, and we'd send a form out to people after they called our hotline, asking them a bunch of questions about their experiences with the police, and one of the questions was, have you ever been convicted of the felon? And this young man hadn't checked the metaphorical box. So I was like, you have a drug felony? I was like, I'm sorry, we cannot represent you if you have a drug felony. So, well, let me tell you what happened. It's like the police planted drugs on me, and they set up me and my friend, and they beat us up, and they framed us. He starts telling me this big, long story about how drugs were planted on him, and the police beat up him and his friend. I am sorry. I cannot represent you if I have a drug felony. And I tried to explain to him that we felt we couldn't represent someone as a lead plaintiff in a racial profiling case if they had a drug felony, because we knew law enforcement would be all over us saying, well, of course the police should be keeping their eye on him. I mean, he's a drug felon. And we knew that if we put him on the stand, he'd be cross-examined. for an hour about his prior criminal history, and his credibility would be undermined in front of the jury, and the jury began to view him as a criminal rather than someone who is the victim of discriminatory police conduct. And so I tried to explain to him, it's wrong, I'm sorry, but there's just no way that we can represent you as a lead plaintiff if you've got a criminal record. He keeps trying to explain to me and give me more facts and tell me what happened. I'm sorry. We cannot represent you. And then he becomes enraged. And he says to me, you're no better than the police. You're no better than the police. The minute I tell you I'm a felon, you just stop listening. You just can't even hear what I have to say. It's like, what's to become of me? It's like, I can't get a job anywhere because of my felony record. Anywhere. It's like, I can't even get into public housing. I have nowhere to sleep and I can't even get into public housing because of my felony record. He's like, I have to sleep in my grandma's basement at night because nowhere else will take me in. It's like, I can't even qualify for food stamps. How am I supposed to feed myself? How am I supposed to take care of myself as a man? What's to become of me? He says, good luck finding one young black man in my neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet. They've gotten to us all already. And he snatches those papers, all of those notes, just begins ripping them up. The tiny little pieces, he's throwing them in the air. It's snowing white paper in my office, and he walks out yelling, you're no better than the police. Can't believe I trusted you. Turns around, takes off. Well, several months after that, I was actually doing a public access television show broadcasting live out of his neighborhood. I was doing public access television because we were trying to organize thousands of people to attend a protest, a demonstration against the governor's refusal to sign racial profiling legislation. And we've been holding town hall meetings up and down the state, doing a ton of media. And it was a couple of days before the demonstration. And I was doing public access TV, telling people, get on the bus, go to the demonstration. It was broadcasting live out of his neighborhood. Well, as soon as the show goes off the air, he comes bursting into the studio carrying this dirty plotted plan. He comes rushing up to me, and he's all emotional, practically on the verge of tears. And he was rushing up to me and thrusts this potted plant in my arms. And he says, I'm just here to tell you I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I've been seeing you on the news. I see you out there trying to fight for our people, trying to do the right thing, and I shouldn't have treated you like that. It's like, I would have bought you some flowers. I still don't have any money. I snatched this plant off my grandma's front porch. Here. He just thrust it in my arms. And then he turns around and runs away. I go chasing him out of the building. He runs out of the building, jumps into this beat-up car, and takes off. Several months after that, I'm in my office, open up the newspaper. What's on the front page? The Oakland Riders police scandal is broken. Turns out that a gang of police officers, otherwise known as a drug task force, had been planting drugs on suspects, beating folks up in his neighborhood. And who's identified as one of the main officers charged with planting drugs on suspects and beating folks up? The officer he had identified to me as having planted drugs on him and beat up him and his friend. And it was only then that the light bulb finally came on for me. And I thought to myself, he's right about me. I'm no better than the police. The minute he told me he was a felon, I just stopped listening. I couldn't even hear what he had to say. And I started asking myself some hard questions of myself as a civil rights lawyer. How am I actually replicating the very forms of discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion I'm supposedly fighting against? And I started asking myself, why is it we haven't been able to find one young black man in his neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet? What is really going on? That was the beginning of my journey, doing an enormous amount of research, asking myself and others a lot of hard questions, and listening more carefully to the stories of those cycling in and out of prison. And what I ultimately learned was that my crime wasn't in refusing to represent an innocent man. My real crime was imagining that there was a path to racial justice that didn't include the voices and stories of those we've branded guilty. And that's how the journey began. And in the process of that, I learned a lot that really blew my mind. I learned there are more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. I learned that it's true that a Black child born during slavery had a better chance of being raised by both parents than a Black child born today. And that this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of Black men. 80% of all African American children today can now expect to at least spend a significant part of their childhood years living apart from their fathers. And contrary to the image presented in the media today of Black men being a bunch of deadbeat dads that don't care enough about their children to do right by them or be involved, the research actually shows that Black men who are separated from their children due to divorce, imprisonment, or any other factor actually make more of an effort to maintain contact with their children following separation than men of any other racial or ethnic group. But no racial or ethnic group faces such extraordinary challenges to playing the role of the traditional father and maintaining meaningful contact with their children. But that hasn't stopped Black men from trying. Now, I know Black men could do a better job of being fathers, but so could white men, so could Latino men, so could Asian men, so could mothers. We could all do a better job of parenting and overcoming the hurdles and challenges that we face in life. But no racial or ethnic group faces such extraordinary structural barriers to performing the role of a traditional father than Black men do today. And this is a phenomenon that doesn't affect some small segment of the African American community. To the contrary, in some major urban areas, more than half of working age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In fact, in some cities like Chicago, if you count prisoners as people, and after all, prisoners are excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment data, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States. But if you actually count prisoners as people, in the Chicago area, nearly 80% of working age African American men have been shown to have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste. A group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people today that I think mass incarceration is like a new caste system or a new Jim Crow, I'm frequently met with shocked disbelief. People say, how can you say that? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. If Black people just stopped running around committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. Many people argue this isn't about race, this is about crime, particularly violent crime. And sadly, Black men are far more likely to be violent. This isn't a race thing, it's a crime thing. Now, there are a number of problems with this line of argument, but I want to make one point at the outset very clear. Violent offenders comprise a very small fraction of the people who cycle in and out of our criminal justice system, a small fraction of those who are trapped in the undercaste. Although about half of all prisoners in some states are classified as violent offenders, that statistic is highly misleading. Violent offenders typically get longer sentences than nonviolent offenders, so they comprise a much larger percentage of the prison population than they would if they had shorter sentences. But more importantly, prisoners reflect a small percentage of those who are under correctional control. Now, this is a fact, I think, that people often fail to grasp, that this system of control, this caste-like system, this criminal justice apparatus governs not just those who are in prison, but also those who are in jail, those who are on parole, those who are on probation. Of the 7.3 million people who are currently under correctional control, only 1.6 million are in prison. The rest are in jail or on probation or on parole, overwhelmingly for nonviolent offenses. Probationers are the clear majority of those who are under community supervision, and only 19% of probationers have been convicted of a crime that could be classified as a violent offense. The most common offense for which probationers are under supervision is a drug offense. Now, when people think of a criminal, they typically don't think of some kid caught with marijuana in his pocket. But the overwhelming majority of arrests are for relatively minor, low-level, nonviolent offenses. In one study, 72% of all criminal cases in Cook County, Chicago, had a drug charge, and 70% of them were Class 4 felony possession, the very lowest level felony charge. Now, these folks are unlikely to get any prison time, but they will be saddled for the rest of their lives with a felony record, simply because they were once caught with drugs. Most of the folks who get swept in to this system of mass incarceration and branded criminals and felons get arrested the very first time. Their very first arrest is for something minor, something that would get ignored in a middle-class white community, on a college campus. It would get ignored because they would never get caught. They would never be viewed as suspicious. They would never be stopped and frisked and searched. They would never be subjected to the level of supervision and monitoring and control the kids growing up in ghetto communities are. But because of who they are, more than what they have done, young kids coming up in ghetto communities are ushered into prisons and jails, branded criminals and felons at young ages, often before they're even old enough to vote, branded, marked for life, while kids on the other side of town, engaging in precisely the same behavior, trot off to college. Now, people often tell me, shouldn't we focus on the front end? Focus on keeping kids in schools, fixing our schools so these young people don't wind up in prison? And my answer is yes. Yes, we have absolutely got to fix our schools. We've got to give each and every one of our kids a quality education so they can exceed in this new global economy. And if we want to bring down violent crime rates, the most important thing we can do in the long term is invest in education and job creation. I mean, there was a time when Black men with limited skills and no high school diploma could get a good job, a good factory job that would support not only himself, but help to support a family. In fact, as William Julius Wilson has noted in his book, When Work Disappears, during the mid-1950s, young Black men were actually more likely to be employed, to have a job, than young white men. But those days are gone. In a stunningly short period of time, work literally vanished from inner city communities. Due to globalization and technological innovations, factories closed down or moved overseas, leaving hundreds of thousands of people in inner city communities jobless, trapped in racially segregated, jobless communities that swiftly transformed into crime-ridden ghettos. So if we want to address the problem of violence, we've got to be willing to address joblessness. William Julius Wilson cites in his book data showing that if you compare white jobless men with black jobless men, the racial disparity in violent crime disappears. Disappears. Now, violence can't be excused by joblessness. Most people who are jobless do not engage in violent crimes. But what we know is that joblessness, particularly chronic joblessness, causes some people to break, some people to snap. It creates conditions that are ripe for violence. So if we are serious about reducing crime and violence in these communities, we have got to be serious about investing in education and job creation. But reducing crime rates will not end mass incarceration. Let me repeat that. Reducing crime rates will not end mass incarceration. As we've seen during the past few decades, it's possible to have falling crime rates with skyrocketing incarceration rates. Crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have had stunningly little to do with one another. During the past few decades, our crime rates have fluctuated, have gone up, have gone down. Today, as bad as crime is in many parts of the country, crime rates are at historical lows. But incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved largely independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime is going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what does explain this sudden, extraordinary explosion in incarceration rates of not crime and crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. Drug convictions alone, just drug convictions, accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state system between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. I mean, to get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. Not by accident, this drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have shown consistently for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now that defies our basic racial stereotypes about who a drug dealer is. If you're honest with yourself and you imagine a drug dealer, you likely imagine some black kid standing in the corner with his pants sagging down. And plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. In fact, some studies have suggested that white youth may be more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. They deal drugs for different reasons, but they are at least, if not more likely, to engage in illegal drug dealing. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. I mean, in some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. I find that when people see this data, they say, yeah, that's bad. That's a bad thing. Those racial disparities, that's a bad thing. But we need this drug war. We need to get tough in those communities because that's where the violent offenders are. That's where the drug kingpins are. Many people say this drug war may be misguided, but it has a benign motive. It's motivated by concern over violent crime, they say. Now, let me be clear. The problem of violence in ghettoized communities is real. It's not imagined. It's not an exaggeration to say that the violence that is ravaging some inner city communities today ought to be considered a human rights violation, a human rights crisis, a crisis on the scale of what is occurring in some war-torn countries abroad. Every human being has a basic human right to safety and security, be able to walk to the corner store without fear being shot at, right to send their children to school in an environment that's reasonably safe and sound. The very same weekend that the Trayvon Martin controversy burst into the national media, there were more than 40 people shot in Chicago. 9 people were killed, including an 8 or 9-year-old girl. Inner city violence spiraled out of control. That didn't make the national news, but Trayvon Martin did. So the violence in some communities is real, and I know that some have argued that after decades, centuries of under-enforcement of criminal laws in Black communities, after centuries of white folks not caring much at all if Black people were victimized, that mass incarceration is a sign that finally, policymakers actually care about crime in Black communities. But there's a problem, I think, with imagining that mainstream white communities swinging from utter indifference to Black victimization to hyper-criminalization of Black people is evidence of progress. Both positions, utter indifference and overwhelming punitiveness, are simply two different sides of the same coin, two different expressions of the same impulse and orientation, the gross devaluation of Black life and experience. And I think there's a problem too with suggesting that many Black people support mass incarceration because some Black politicians and activists have championed get tough measures. It's true, of course, that in desperation to deal with violence, some Black leaders and Black activists have called for get tough measures, have supported the war on drugs, have asked for more police, more prisons. But let's be clear, that's not all they've asked for. That's not all they've demanded. It never has been. They've also demanded good schools, economic investment, job training, and job development. Yet it seems that the only thing that poor folks of color ask for and get is police and prisons. And then we feign surprise when some community leaders resist, when criminal justice reformers swoop into communities and say, well, there's nothing we can do about your failing schools, and we can't address joblessness, chronic joblessness, and we can't do that much about the crime that's plaguing your communities, but we're thinking about reducing the number of police on the street. Does that sound like a good deal to you? This is the problem with treating criminal justice reform as an isolated issue, as something that is separate from education reform, separate from job creation. This is the problem with treating criminal justice reform, prison reform, as something independent, not part of a broader movement for social and racial justice that addresses what is going on in the real lives of people who are affected by crime and violence. It's not enough to say we want to reform the police or reduce the prison population if you're not also willing to say we're serious about doing something about joblessness, about your failing schools. If there is no hope offered to people in these communities that the day-to-day conditions of their lives will ever turn around. Now, given this level of desperation, it's no wonder that many communities believe that the war on drugs and get tough approaches are an unfortunate necessity. But what's remarkable is that the data shows that even in these communities, folks are less likely to be punitive than rural whites. Rural whites are the least likely to be victimized by violent crime. the most likely to be punitive. Black folks are the most likely to be victimized by violent crime, and yet least likely to be punitive or purely punitive in their approach to dealing with problems of crime and violence. What's going on with that? Is this linked in some way to our racial history and our racial politics, the struggles to end the old Jim Crow, the Southern strategy of dividing poor and working class whites from poor folks of color, to imagine that poor folks of color ought to be dealt with harshly and controlled because their interests are diametrically opposed, many poor whites imagine, to their own interests? I think yes. But sadly, many of these communities struggling with crime and violence have been sold a bill of goods. They've been told that a drug war is necessary, not realizing, not understanding that this drug war has never been aimed primarily at rooting out violent offenders or drug kingpins. Federal funding has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. State and local law enforcement agencies have been rewarded in cash by the millions for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system, which helps to explain why so many police officers go out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible in efforts to get their numbers up and to continue to qualify for the funding that their budgets now rely upon. And drug forfeiture laws have granted state and local law enforcement agencies a direct monetary interest, not in ending drug abuse or drug addiction, but in the longevity of this war. State and local law enforcement agencies are now allowed to keep for their own use up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes seized from suspected drug offenders. Suspected, you don't have to be convicted, just suspected. Your cash can be taken off of you, your cars forfeited. Giving law enforcement direct monetary interest in the longevity of this war, and the results are predictable. The overwhelming majority of people swept into this system through the drug war are arrested for primarily non-violent, relatively minor drug offenses. 4 out of 5 drug arrests for simple possession, only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or even significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging this drug war, almost exclusively in the hood, we've created a vast new racial undercast in an astonishingly short period of time. Now, where has the U.S. Supreme Court been in all of this? Well, far from offering any resistance to this new regime, the U.S. Supreme Court has facilitated the rise of this new system of control, eviscerating Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. Once upon a time, the police couldn't just roll up to a young person on the street and stop them, interrogate them about who they are, where they're going, what they're doing, without any evidence of criminal activity, without any reasonable suspicion, or without any probable cause. Today, of course, the police are entitled to do precisely that, as long as they get consent. And what's consent? Consent is when a police officer does what George Zimmerman did, roll up to someone with a badge and a gun and say, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And if that young person complies and says, puts up his hands, that's interpreted as consent. Police officer says, we turn around so I can frisk you, see if you got anything on you? And kid says, turns around. Consent. It's just waived as Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. And even in that rare instance where a young man might be so bold enough to say, "No, officer, keep walking." Even in a rare instance when someone is so bold as to think they can refuse consent to search, get away with it. It's their word against the police officers in a court of law about what was said on the sidewalk that night or on the side of the road. In this way, the U.S. Supreme Court has given the police license to stop, frisk, search just about anyone, anywhere, without a shred of evidence of criminal activity. Many people say, well, why not just file more racial profiling lawsuits? People don't realize is that the cases that I was bringing back then can't even be filed anymore. The U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it doesn't matter how overwhelming the statistical evidence is. It doesn't matter how severe the racial disparities are. Unless you can offer proof of conscious intentional bias, tantamount to an admission by a law enforcement officer, you can't even state a claim for racial bias in the criminal justice system today. Now, this poses quite a challenge, of course, in the so-called era of colorblindness, when everyone knows better than to say their racial biases out loud. Police officers don't often say, yes, Your Honor, I stopped him because he was black. Prosecutors don't often say, well, yeah, I would have given a better plea deal, you know, but kid's from the hood, he's black, it seems like he's up to no good. No. Police officers, prosecutors, like the rest of us, know better than to state our racial biases and stereotypes out loud. But more importantly, so many of the biases and stereotypes that drive discretionary decision-making by law enforcement today operate on such an unconscious level that many well-intentioned, good officers can't even admit to themselves their biases. Well-intentioned officer sees a group of young black kids walking down the street and he thinks, oh, I better jump out, frisk them, search them, see what they're up to, do my job. Thought would never occur to them. Driving in a different neighborhood, see a group of young white kids walking down the street. Thought would never enter his mind. That officer may not mean any harm to those young black men, but those discretionary decisions over and over again based on conscious and unconscious bias add up to enormous disparities in our system. But the Supreme Court says we can't even challenge those disparities in a court of law. And in this way, the U.S. Supreme Court has immunized the system from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it rallied to the defense of slavery and Jim Crow in their day. But of course, being swept into the system is just the beginning. For once you're branded a criminal or a felon, you're then ushered into a parallel social universe in which all of the civil and human rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement no longer apply to you. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And it doesn't matter whether that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or 35 years ago. The rest of your life, checking the box. You'll be denied housing. Young man trying to do right by his family, return home to his children. If his children live in public housing, his partner, his spouse lives in public housing, the whole family risks eviction, just letting him come home. In some states, can't even qualify for food stamps if you've been convicted of a drug felony. Can't even get food. What do we expect people returning home from prison to do? Can't get a job, barred from housing, even food stamps may be off limits to you. Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. In a growing number of states, you're actually expected to pay back the cost of your imprisonment. And then if you're one of the lucky few who actually manages to get a job, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. See, what is the system designed to do? What does it seem designed to do? Seems designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what in fact happens about 70% of the time. About 70% of people released from prison return within a few years, and the majority of those who return do so in a matter of months in some states because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America and inspiring a recommitment. We have now spent more than $1 trillion just waging the drug war since it began. Funds that could have been used for education, funds that could have been used for job creation, for economic investment in the communities that need it most, funds that could have paved the way for a collective well-being. Instead, those dollars paved the way for destruction of countless lives and families and dreams. Now, if you imagine that we can reverse this without a major movement, that there's a shortcut, that we can tinker with this system somehow and get it right, consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs, before the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Private prison companies would be forced to watch their profits vanish. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, or economic structure, it's not going to just fade away. It's not going to go down without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know that there are many scholars and advocates today who claim that movement building is unnecessary and that it is a mistake, a grave mistake to force difficult conversations about race. They say it is the very last thing we should be doing, is framing this as a racial justice movement. It would only polarize the public, install or perhaps even reverse progress. Many point that we've already begun to see some prison downsizing. Many say we may be reaching a turning point, a tipping point, as prison downsizing is already underway in a number of states, and that will jeopardize this criminal justice reform by turning things into a race issue and calling for movement building. And it is true that a unique moment of opportunity exists right now to challenge mass incarceration and the caste-like system that has been created, a bigger opportunity than we've had in decades. For the first time in more than 40 years, we have former Get Tough true believers like Newt Gingrich calling for prison downsizing. Now, this change of heart, though, hasn't been inspired by sudden awakening to the basic humanity of those cycling in out of prisons and jails or those trapped in the undercast. No, the surge in interest in prison downsizing has been driven by fiscal concerns, a desperate effort to avoid raising taxes on the white middle class and to rescue state budgets during a time of economic crisis. Now, this apparent opportunity has led many well-intentioned activists, many well-intentioned folks in the civil rights community and outside that community to say, we need to just maximize this political moment, not alienate folks by talking about race or racial justice. We should just stick to dollars and cents and show that it's cheaper to send a kid to college than to lock them up behind bars. We can talk about movement building later. Let's just squeeze what we can out of the current political moment and see how far we can get. Just today, I read an article on the Huffington Post by Reverend Al Sharpton saying that it's a mistake to turn the Trayvon Martin tragedy into a race issue. He says it's not about race. It's just about a young teenage boy who was killed, and that teenage boy could have been anybody's son. It couldn't have been anybody's son. It wasn't anybody's son. And it's astonishing, really, how terrified we have become of ever talking openly and honestly about race. We are facing a profound moral crisis in this country, one that is deeply rooted in our nation's history, nation's politics, and anxieties, a crisis of the magnitude faced during Jim Crow. And if we fail to get this, really get this, we may find ourselves worse off 10 years from now than we are today. My greatest fear is that we're going to see some prison downsizing in the months and years to come. We will. But we'll reach then a new plateau. It'll be a level of imprisonment that is unconscionable by global standards. I mean, even if we cut our prison population in half, we would still be high by global standards. So we'll see some prison downsizing. It'll come down somewhat, and reformers and politicians will pat themselves on the back and say, job well done, we did what we could, given the reality of the political constraints that we're facing, and then folks will move on. That temporary moment of opportunity, that temporary moment of interest convergence, one of those rare moments when the perceived self-interests of whites and the interests of poor folks of color intersect, and then it'll be gone. And the caste system will remain perfectly intact. Millions of people will continue to cycle in and out of prison. They may stay for 5 years rather than 10. They may stay for 2 years rather than 6. They may get just felony probation instead of prison time. We can cut our prison population in half just by reducing in half the length of prison sentences. But this caste system would remain intact. Millions of people would still cycle in and out of prison, saddled with criminal records, unable to find work, barred even from voting, unable to get housing, barred from food stamps. The new Jim Crow would still be alive and well, just modified. And then, after we reach this new plateau, the political winds may change again, crime rates may rise, the economic crisis may pass, and there will be nothing, absolutely nothing, that will prevent the race to incarcerate from beginning again. And because advocates were too afraid to deal with the root cause of mass incarceration, a cause that has little to do with crime or even crime rates, the root cause of mass incarceration being the failure of us as a nation to care, really extend care, compassion, and concerns across lines of race and class. Our failure to care and our habit of demonizing people along race and class lines for political gain, our failure to deal with this root cause will make it easy for the race to incarcerate to begin again, and this time it will begin with a horrifying baseline. When the first race to incarcerate began, there were less than 400,000 people in prison. Today, there are nearly 2.4 million. And I remember when we passed the 1 million mark and people were astounded. No one ever dreamed we would reach 2 million. 1 million blew people's minds. Now we're past 2 million. What do you think would happen if we began a race to incarcerate with 1.8 million prisoners as the baseline? 1.5? You think we couldn't get to 3 million? Think we couldn't get to 4? As long as poor people of color are viewed as largely disposable, with the only limiting principle being how much it costs to throw them away, caste-like systems will be a recurring, if not permanent, feature of American life. Already we've seen how private prison companies have begun writing these harsh immigration laws in order to ensure a new market for private prisons. Now, this is an excellent example, an excellent illustration of what happens when a group of people are defined as a problem. Not having problems, but when a group of people become defined as the problem, suddenly a familiar politics kicks in. Discriminatory laws are passed. It becomes easy to think about controlling them, disposing of them. And so we see that the politics that gave rise to the drug war and gave rise to mass incarceration are now leading to a prison building boom aimed at the so-called illegal immigrants. The reality we have got to face is that these systems of racial and social exclusion and division will continue to be born again until we are willing to do what Dr. King urged us to do, which is to force a confrontation, to force an honest confrontation, to force our nation to face the truth about race and what it has done and continues to do to our nation today. I believe it will take a movement, a human rights movement, a movement for education, not incarceration, a movement for jobs, not jails, a movement to end all forms of discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them their basic human rights to work and to shelter and to food. But before this movement can even get underway, we're honest. Before this movement can even get underway, a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we're in to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has formed the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thank you so much for having me.